To speak about Beethoven 250 years after his birth is not an easy task. In fact, is a very big challenge because we know that Beethoven has been one of the most performed composers of all time, and particularly in the last 100 years or so, his works have been profusely recorded by wonderful musicians. So this talk and this lecture recital, if you want to call it that way, wants to shed a different perspective, and I want to speak about a composer, a great pianist, and a wonderful musician overall, the Portuguese José Vianna da Motta. Vianna da Motta was one of the greatest pianists of his time. He lived in Berlin for many years, since he was 14 years of age. And when he was 17 in 1885, he wanted to study with Liszt in Weimar. And in his memories, he wrote that he wanted to study with Liszt because he was the greatest Beethoven interpreter of all. And this is very interesting because such a young man wanted to go to Liszt, and already having this vision of Liszt as a great Beethoven interpreter is not very common, perhaps, particularly if we think of a time of great virtuosity, where Liszt was, of course, one major exponent of this way of playing the piano. Of course, Vianna da Motta would remain truly faithful to Liszt's memory, and he is regarded today as one of the biggest exponents of the last generation of Liszt disciples. But then he went on to, after Liszt's death in the following year, in 1886, he went on to study with Hans von Bülow. And of course, Hans von Bülow was one great Beethoven interpreter as well, and Vianna da Motta admired him very much. And apart from that, Vianna da Motta lived in a time where he met other exponents of Beethoven interpreters like Eugene d'Albert, Frédéric Lamont, and Busoni himself. He was a great friend of Vianna da Motta's. So he lived in an era where there was a great interest in Beethoven. To let you know about the dimension of Vianna da Motta, I will read some statements of some of his contemporaries, disciples, and also by Vianna da Motta himself, to get the picture how he was as a musician, an interpreter, and a thinker of music. And then we'll go on and speaking about the revisitation of two sonatas through the inspirational eyes of Vianna da Motta's performing editions. The Sonata Opus 7 and the Sonata Opus 31, number 2, known as Tempest Sonata. Critique of publishing 1930 in the Belgian periodical Neptune in Antwerp, said that Da Motta is therefore today one of the two world pianists who share that secret of the Beethoven interpretation, which is to attain simple greatness. Well, we don't know really who that other pianist was, but possibly Schnabel, I don't know. He has been often compared with Schnabel in the sense that he introduced a modern way of interpreting Beethoven. But as we'll see, that things are not that simple. Anyway, this is a critique in 1930 in Belgium. And another statement from his pupil, his former pupil, Fernando Lopes Graça. Lopes Graça was one of the greatest Portuguese composers, and Lopes Graça said that his respect for the master's thought leads him to consult various editions, comparing and criticizing them until he reaches a pure text regarding not only the style but also the composer's intentions, revealing the work's most subtle and precious minutiae, bringing to light unsuspected details, not hesitating to alter the original piano orthography to serve the aesthetic purpose better. The same Lopes Graça, a wonderful composer, one of the most important 20th century composers in Portugal, said as well that what he did not mix up was the letter, that is, the unequivocal system of symbols through which the musical thought materializes in the score, with the orthography, that is, the manner more or less correct, more or less practical, in which those symbols are ordered in writing. And when he introduced changes in words for which he had full respect, Vianna da Motta had in mind to obtain a better translation of the sound symbols from the point of view of instrumental technique, and therefore to achieve a more faithful rendering of the musical thought. This is again, as I said, Lopes Graça. And again, Lopes Graça said this small sentence, which is very revealing. In the art of phrasing, then, I believe our pianist, Vianna da Motta, to be hardly surmountable. Another of his former students, musicologist João de Freitas Branco, who wrote his biography, said that Vianna da Motta's fingerings were frequently true findings, ingenious solutions which, once learned, seemed as Columbus's head. The distribution of the notes between the hands, changing some from the right to the left or the other way around, facilitated a great deal the execution of particularly transcendental passages. And then I would like to finish this group of statements by quoting Vianna da Motta himself, and in a foreword to his edition of Carl Czerny's Studies Opus 74, published in Lisbon by Sassetti, and he wrote this much. Fingering is of great importance to the execution of any work. Everything depends on rational fingering, not only safety, clarity and equality, but also memory, articulation and phrasing. One can judge an artist's musicianship through his fingering. In order to choose a correct fingering, it is necessary to have fantasy and imagination. Fingering is also an act of creation. So after these statements, which ended with one by Vianna da Motta himself, I want to show you the beginning of the manuscript edition that Vianna da Motta left us of the Opus 7 Sonata. If we compare the two texts, the word text by Henley edition and the Vianna da Motta's edition, we can see that there is a sort of revolution in the orthography, as Lopes Graça called it, of the musical text. To begin with, we have a differentiation of the roles in the left hand. So we have a bass note that is separated from the rest of the repeated E flats, and this gives right away not only a sense of continuity of the repeated E flats, which are joined together, but also the bass note, which appears to be like a sort of an arch separated from the rest of the other notes. This gives an extraordinary dimension that comes also from Liszt and from Hans von Bülow, which is an orchestral view of the piano. So we can see right away that this induces a sort of interpretation. And then the theme in the right hand is also distributed in a very different manner. So we don't have this formal writing of Beethoven, but then we have the interpretation of phrasing throughout the whole sentence. So it is not just merely a succession of notes, but these notes are distributed in order to clarify their meaning within the musical sentence. If we play Beethoven, we probably tend to look at the word text and play all these notes without any particular meaning. But in Vianna da Motta, we try to understand how this phrasing, this articulation will work out. This. And then, of course, this all will result subtle when you play in tempo, in the allegro molto con brio. But I think there's something to think about what meaning do each note have among the musical discourse. There is a similar phrasing design, if you want to call it like that, in the first movement of Opus 31, number 2. If we look at this passage, well, Beethoven doesn't write really any phrasing in the quavers of the right hand, and then in the left hand when they appear. Still, if we think about Vianna da Motta's suggestion, he then adds some articulation that clarify, in the same way that he did in the beginning of the first movement of Opus 7, clarify his intention, a different intention in phrasing. Again, I am playing a bit slower in order to be easier to understand the meaning of what Beethoven intends. But I think this clarifies again, at least it prevents that the performance becomes mechanical. There is also an interesting idea in the phrasing of the left hand in this passage. Again, Beethoven writes in the word text. He writes very plainly the quavers. But Vianna da Motta writes phrasings again, and he clarifies again the roles of the bass note and then the inflections of the rest of the quavers. And of course we can only think of instrumental writing again. And of course the passage begins. These are only very slight examples because there is no time for more, but in terms of phrasing, but I think they are revealing of the level of detail that Vianna da Motta has when thinking about making an edition, in this case of Beethoven. It is also interesting to notice a pedagogical dimension in this edition of Opus 31 number 2. I would only give you 2 examples which appear perhaps a bit naive for the experienced musician, but which are valuable advice for the not so experienced student. So I give you 2 little examples that Vianna da Motta puts in a footnote in this edition, his edition of Opus 31 number 2, and of course one is the warning against not connecting the 2 notes, which is a very common mistake, of course even in more experienced pianists, but he wants to warn against that. And another warning, which is really a valuable warning, is this passage which Vianna da Motta warns against this effect of. So he says it has to be very well connected. And of course, when the right hand is playing, this may occur, and it is really important to be able to sing the notes, and of course keep the phrasing of the right hand. So obviously there cannot be too much pedal. I would like now to give you an example of fingering in these editions. There are numerous very interesting and original fingerings by Vianna da Motta for these two sonatas. And of course, this is an important feature, as we heard in the beginning, by statements of Vianna da Motta himself and also his pupil João Freitas Branco. And of course there are numerous examples, as João Freitas Branco says, of splitting notes between hands very cleverly. But since we have limited time, I will give you an example from the fourth movement of the Sonata Opus 7. In this sonata, Vianna da Motta writes a passage very interestingly fingered, where he uses the full extension of the hand and putting the fifth finger on the black key, E flat, and then turning the thumb under to E natural, and to follow this long scale, which ends in with the repetition of the fifth finger. This, of course, is much in the manner of allegedly of Liszt, or reportedly, but also of Chopin. If we think about the final bars of the Nocturne Opus 9, number 2, and we have a similar passage where he puts the hand into a lighter position and repeats the fourth and fifth finger. This is very clever by Vianna da Motta, because he uses the full extension of the hand in order to minimize the turning of the thumb and the changing of position. And when he comes up in the portato element of the scale in the upper notes in pianissimo, by using only the fourth and fifth finger, then he puts the hand in a very lighter position. And this is what Chopin certainly intended. Also, this manner of using the full extension of the hand may be related to Schnabel's concept of handings rather than fingerings. And of course, this is a group of handings that minimizes, as I said earlier, the turning of the thumb under. I would like to speak to you now about the compass of the instrument regarding to Beethoven's writings. We know that in his first 20 sonatas, in which these two are included, Beethoven had a piano with a limited range of F. This F to this F. So his music was limited to that range, and that seemed to reportedly upset Beethoven. And of course, when he had a piano with a wider compass, then he managed to write and use those longer range of the piano. So if we know this beginning of the sonata, starts like this. However, in the beginning of the development section, Beethoven doesn't write what should be the same. Instead, he writes then he goes on with further chords. That means he uses a full octave of chords more than he did in the beginning. That is because in the correspondent manner you wouldn't have the sufficient notes, and this would, if we were to interpret Beethoven's will as being that of the beginning of the development section, then we would have to play the beginning and then, of course, and this is what I think I should do if I believe that I'm playing in a modern instrument that has these notes, and that in my mind, in my view, translates better what Beethoven would have intended. Otherwise, he wouldn't have begun the development section with that full chord. This is also valuable for the recitativo section, because if you know, as we see, Beethoven puts a long pedal, and of course this harmonically gives much more support to the passage. And when it comes then further with the C major chord, it is the same. You will have noticed that I have played C instead of D flat in that semi-quaver. And of course, Vianna da Motta writes C and claims that Reinecke in his letters on Beethoven claimed that the proper note should be a C, and then that Schenker found out that in fact Beethoven had scratched the D flat and put a C. The Handley edition also says, and a footnote, that there is an edition in the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde in Wien that has that amendment supposedly by the hand of Beethoven. Of course, we have to be coherent when we play these lower range chords, and then in the transition to the recitative, and also in the transition to the repeat of the first section of the sonata, the exposition, we should add octaves in the left hand in order for the voicing to remain coherent. So these last remarks on the range, the compass of the piano, were further reflections of my own. They are not in Vianna da Motta's edition. Although he uses lower octaves to put more power and strength in both in the Opus 7 and in other movements, in the third movement, for instance, of Opus 31, number 2. I would like to finish now with a striking example of the third movement, the trio section of the third movement of Opus 7. In this section, the tradition is to play the trio tempestuous in a tempestuous manner and very rapid and energetic. This has been the tradition for as long as we can remember in basically every recording and every performance, at least that I have heard. Still, Vianna da Motta proposes a different solution. He changes the triplets and the crotchet beat of the 3/4 time into a 6/4 compound meter, binary meter, thus removing the emphasis on the crotchet beat, on the energy of the crotchet. I interpret that as wanting to have less stress and play a little slower, somewhat slower, and also the voicing that he had on the upper note of the triplets creates a really almost Schubert-like pathos, atmospheric writing. It is interesting to notice that the closest testimony that we have is by Czerny, the closest to Beethoven, of course. And Czerny speaks of this trio as being legato and harmonious. So perhaps the tradition that we have inherited throughout the 20th century is open still to reflections and go into these earlier sources, like the one that Vianna da Motta is, because Vianna da Motta was closer to the Beethoven tradition than objectively we are, because it's been longer than that. But also we can also reflect about this testimonials of journey. I don't mean to say that this is the right way to perform, but it certainly is an interesting way, and this is what I chose to do. So I will play the beginning of the first section of the trio, and then in the repeat I will do it the way Beethoven, the way Vianna da Motta, I'm sorry, would have meant it. So firstly the traditional way of playing, and then Vianna da Motta's way of playing. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and please, if you want to pay attention for my recording to be released later this year of these two sonatas, where you can see these features that I spoke about, and then others that were inspired by Vianna da Motta's edition, but also then further reflected upon by myself. Thank you very much.